Dr. John Bishop is the founder of Forge, a ministry forming men in virtue. He was on campus for the Symposium on Transforming Culture here at Benedictine College, where he spoke about the great need to continue forming men of all ages in virtuous masculinity in the image of Christ. I invited him to the studio to discuss the state of masculinity today and many of the cultural dynamics that men face when trying to live a virtuous life. Benedictine College is transforming culture in America, one conversation at a time. From our studios in Atchison, Kansas, these are the Benedictine Dialogues. All right, John, welcome to the Benedictine Dialogues. Thank you so much for coming to campus, and great to have this chat with you.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I haven't been back to BC in 5 years or so, and every time you're back at Benedictine, there's about 13 or 14 new buildings, and so it's
right.
Good to be here.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I found out today that this was actually Farrell Hall at one point. I didn't know that, so that's interesting.
We're in Elizabeth Hall right now. I guess Elizabeth was Jim Farrell. Is that the guy's name?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, Jim Farrell's wife, and so it's good to be in her building now. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Well, I thought to get started on this with this conversation, I've been in ministry for 15, 20 years. When I first got into ministry, it was largely reaching out to young men, to young athletes in particular, talking about issues of masculinity, some of the things in their formation maybe that they missed, and what I wanted to hear from you, it's been 20 years. Has the needle moved? What are you seeing? Is it improving? Are we continuing down this kind of path that we saw 20 years ago? What's your kind of state of affairs with the whole world of men right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. The world of men, both inside and outside the church, has certainly changed in the last 20 years. And I think that our first little glimmers of hope in all of the negative downward trends pertaining to masculinity are just starting to see upticks in like male church participation amongst Gen Z Catholics and Gen Z Christians at large. The first time that you've had statistics come out like that, Pew Research, just in the last 6 months. So it's wild that there might actually be a change finally happening, a sort of bottoming out, and then the numbers improving. But what you might call the crisis of masculinity, both inside and outside the church, is alive and well. There's a lot of work to do, and it's still the case, for example, that over 60% of your average church congregation, Catholic or mainstream Protestant, on any given Sunday in the United States is female, and less than 40% is male. So the disparity between male-female church participation is strong, and it only gets worse when you're at something like a youth group, right? Or I worked for many years for a large Catholic nonprofit that was actually, I thought, did a great job ministering to engaging men. So I worked at Focus. I assume a lot of our listeners might know about Focus, Fellowship of Catholic University Students, big college ministry. And I worked for them for 8.5 years, and anything that we ever did was flooded with women, but very, very, very few men, to the extent that I kind of remember thinking, in all the initiatives that I ran at Focus, all the ones that I were involved with, from the major C conferences to the Bible study ratios to boutique programs like one called Summer Projects to Focus's retreat program, really the whole game, Focus Missions, really the whole game of getting getting folks to getting initiatives off the ground was to get at least a few men to participate in those things. And it was growing up in that church and working in that church that motivated me to say, gosh, like we gotta do something to increase our engagement with men. And turn the tide on this. And so that's how I got interested in working with men and in what I'm doing now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I'm sure there's several factors as to why men, and particularly young men, aren't participating in some of these things. I'm sure you know a lot of the factors.
Yeah.
And I now have young men growing up that I've got just about 17-year-old who participates in some things, and he tells me exactly what he doesn't like, about certain aspects of it. And so a lot of it is geared more towards a feminine way of expressing themselves and a feminine way of worshiping. And so a lot of like what I've spoken to young men about, and even when I first got into ministry, I started doing like MMA camps.
Yeah.
Like, let's just bring a guy who wrestled in college, come show us some stuff.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, maybe we'll read a little bit of like, some of the Old Testament and maybe a gospel passage of some kind. And that's it, but they came for the wrestling.
Right.
Of course, that's younger men for sure, but it was geared towards something they were interested in first.
That's right. Yeah. I think that there's something to be said for what I often say is if you wanted to introduce somebody to Christ, specifically a man, if you want to show him the gospel, so to speak, then get him going on a project, and along the way introduce him to the Lord, right? The face-to-face, conversations for most men, especially in early stages of maturity, faith formation is going to be a really difficult thing. But it's much easier to get two guys side by side, right? And to get them talking about things. A lot of the things that I've really seen take off in the world of men's apostolate have to do with men who are kind of going out and solving some problem, men who want to summit some peak, to go and accomplish some external end, if you will. And the entire ministry is kind of couched in those terms, like even things like we are going to go out and feed these poor people,
Yes.
we are going to go out and build that school, or, so on and so forth. It's a lot easier for a guy to get interested in something like that than it is to immediately say, hey, we just sit in a circle and talk about the Gospel of John, right? There's almost immediate difficulty, right,
Yes.
with that. Whereas for our feminine counterparts, that instinct against vulnerability isn't quite as strong, right? I do think you can get men there, right? And there's a lot of kind of good ways to do it and bad ways to do it. I also don't think it's bad that it takes men a long time to get there. Sometimes I think that when people are trying to engage men in their ministry, their instinct is to, let's just kind of like, figure out how we can get men to do face-to-face vulnerable emotional things very quickly. I just don't think that's how they're wired. I think the world, especially the Catholic world, would readily acknowledge it's a good thing for a man to be a protector, right? Men are they're sort of they sense threats very quickly. Their eyes are on the horizon, both emotionally and obviously physically. You don't want to ruin that part of them, and so simply being rather than kind of trying to force vulnerability too quickly, acknowledging the beauty of masculinity and saying, okay, I've let's say you're a youth minister and you've got these high school girls and you got these high school boys. I would just square with the fact right from the beginning that you might be able to get the high school girls to a place of vulnerability on the first evening, and square with a 6-month process, for the high school boys. Don't push them, right? It's almost like asking them to sort of like check their man card at the door in order to enter into the religious setting. Work with the fact, that it's going to take longer to do things with them instead of forcing the issue. Yeah.
And then there's a process of trust that goes along with that,
Right.
of can I trust this person to be vulnerable? Because I think one of the biggest fears for men, especially young men, is to appear weak.
Right.
And if you have to open up your heart in a way, whether or not that's, in a strong way, but they don't see it that way, of this is me being weak right now, trying to show where I've been weak maybe in my life or how I haven't given my life to Christ. And I think one of the difficulties is that we really have confused, now I would say maybe 2 or 3 generations of what the role of men in society is. I think that even that idea of protection, I know that that's a total natural part of who we are. In fact, as you said, even sitting in a restaurant, I want to see the
Where
restaurant.
is everybody?
Where is everybody? Nobody's behind me.
Right. I love sitting in the corner where I can see the
Exactly.
entire thing, and most men do.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's a totally natural part of who we are. It's something God put in us. It's also an evolutionary reality that we have to be aware of all threats to the tribe and threats to our families.
Yeah.
But that has been disvalued quite a bit in our culture, and it hasn't been either replaced or redefined in any way. And so guys are like, well, wait a minute. I try to be protective and nobody wants me around.
That's right. That's right.
So we've confused them. And so because of that, they're like, well, I don't even know the steps to get to the place of being vulnerable because I have to stay in this constant mode of protection just for myself.
Yeah.
I think that confusion causes a lot of these issues.
Yeah. That confusion causes so much of the issues there. I do want to, before I talk about the issues that have led to this confusion of the masculine role, I think that'd be a great thing to sketch out here in a moment. I do want to make sure that our listeners kind of hear loud and clear that I do think men are very apt and attracted to an authentic masculine vulnerability. We were talking about this before we sat down for the podcast. I spent several years of my life studying the kind of the aspects of male psychology that are unique to men. And over the course of that process, one of the things that I tried to hone in on over and over again is, where are the places where men can be vulnerable? And what I found is that men, paradoxically, are willing to be vulnerable in the places where they feel utterly safe. So it's like women want to be safe. Everybody says that. There's a sense in which men have an even more intense desire for safety than women, especially when it comes to sort of psychological, emotional dynamics. Sure. So, for example, men flock to things like, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, and not just because men get addicted in higher rates than women. They far outpace that disparity. And I think they love places like Alcoholics Anonymous or other settings, like men really love all male settings where there's a sense of secrecy. I think they crave those things because they know that the vulnerability that is expressed in those places doesn't go anywhere else. So they might show a chink in the armor in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, but anybody who's ever been a part of the beautiful organization, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, knows that what's discussed in the meetings, there's an intimacy there, right? And what's talked about in a church basement Alcoholics Anonymous meeting doesn't get talked about in a Tuesday afternoon boardroom, okay? That kind of thing, that space is a space that men crave. And if you can cultivate that kind of space in any sort of church apostolate, then I think you're well on your way to engaging your men in a robust fashion that can lead them to sanctity, okay? Yeah. But you brought up an even more important point, I think, in the fact that men in today's world are just confused. What is my role? In a world where there's no distinction between the sexes, in a world that has increasingly become plastic with respect to masculine and feminine roles, what do I do? And that place where humanity resides right now, particularly in Western culture, we've been brewing that for years. Yeah. I often go back. I think a lot of the confusion in academia about the sexes, and especially masculinity, goes back to, there's a figure named Joseph Pleck that very few people have ever heard of. He wrote a book called The Myth of Masculinity in the 1970s. And in that book, one of the things that Joseph Pleck said was that masculinity needs to be thrown out the window because society's version of masculinity at the time was so constricting as to even cause psychological damage. And so he would give the example, he'd say, hey, look, if you are not a 6'4" white Anglo-Saxon male who has kind of a penchant for athletics, and a driven choleric personality, then you are simply not going to live up to society's understanding of masculinity. And since, oh wow, looks like 98% of you don't live up to that 98% is going to be anxious. They're going to have, they're going to commit suicide. They're never going to feel like they're man enough, so to speak. So since this ideal of masculinity, which is obviously very culturally conditioned in the time of Joseph Pleck, you might think of like your sort of classic, he would give the example of John Wayne a lot. He's like, we can't all be John Wayne. And since we can't be John Wayne, we're anxious about the fact that we can't be John Wayne. Let's just throw the John Wayne ideal out the window, okay? So he then says masculinity is a myth, hence the title of the book. And with every year that followed in the psychological establishment, masculinity was viewed increasingly to be a toxic thing, such that I remember talking with the head of the American Psychological Association Society for Men and Masculinities. And he had recently released an article in the 2022 edition of that society's journal that said if you go back from 1970 through to 2022, 85% of all references to males across all journals of the American Psychological Association, 85% of references to males are negative. So that is in the most powerful psychological organization on planet Earth, the American Psychological Association. That organization, 85% of the time that it says anything about men, says that masculinity is a negative societal construct. Okay, that's deeply problematic. Yeah. Right? Because obviously what happens in academia sort of trickles out to the broader society. And while that kind of cashes out in your 17-year-old boy, for example, is boys who sort of grow up, whether they can articulate it or not, with a sense that a certain part of them, that is the male part of them, is kind of unfit. It's a leper, right? We need to do away with that part of you. Okay, they don't like that, and young boys naturally want society to recognize them for their masculinity. And when their universities, their schools, this bleeds into churches. When churches don't recognize them, then they go to places that will recognize them as men. In some places, they go to the streets. In other instances, they go to the YouTube manosphere. They find characters like Andrew Tate. If they're lucky, they find characters like Jordan Peterson, right? And they find somebody who will sort of teach them to be a man. Unfortunately, for the reasons that I've said thus far, our universities and unfortunately also often our churches aren't giving them a masculine ideal because it's been deconstructed.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple aspects to that really are coming up to my mind. One is that what we call toxic masculinity, and don't get me wrong, I do think there are some traits such as violence and things like that get associated with masculinity. Then I would say, yes, we do need to be very careful of these things because men can become violent. That's the reality of it, right?
Right.
But that's such a limiting understanding of what it means to be a man, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing more beautiful than a man that disciplines his son and then embraces him.
That's right.
I think that's a beautiful
that's an image.
Mixture of the lion and the lamb.
Yeah.
Right, that you need both, that you need to have, it's what Jordan Peterson always says, like, no, you should be a monster, just learn how to control it.
Right.
And that to me is a much broader understanding of what we're talking about masculinity, because yes, men can love, and that's not toxic.
Yeah.
It should never be considered toxic, right? And it's kind of a different piece of the puzzle of having a whole humanity, of you have the feminine love and the masculine love come together, especially in the formation of children. You have to have both. And that the masculine love can be hard, but also very soft. And that softness actually creates less trauma in children because they realize I'm safe, even though I have to follow the rules.
Right. There is this being who's in the mind of a child, the most powerful being in the universe.
Yes.
I'm 5'8" and basically have a normal build, but for my 2.5-year-old son, I'm basically God. I'm the most powerful being in the universe, and when I'm gentle with him, right, there's something that happens there that is demonstrably healthy for kids and that can't be replaced. By the love of a mother. So it's like there's not. Sure, there are bad versions, toxic versions of masculinity. But there's also a dimension of masculinity that's utterly sacred, right, and irreplaceable.
Yes.
When people talk about toxic masculinity, I like the way that you kind of made a distinction there. Sure, there are toxic masculine qualities in certain, sort of sociological. Say this differently. There are toxic masculine qualities in certain cultural contexts, right? And if by toxic masculinity you are referring just to that, well, okay, I agree with you. That seems to be sort of uninteresting almost. Yeah. But if by toxic masculinity you are saying, either explicitly or implicitly, that expressions of masculinity, period, are negative, and they all are, well, that's deeply problematic. And what I actually say, so hear me out on this, that version of toxic masculinity is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And here's what I mean by that. In much the same way that I said before, boys want to be recognized by broader society or by a group of individuals as men. That's why, even though masculinity has looked different across time and place, there's a wonderful book by a guy named Michael Gurian called Manhood in the Making, where he does a cross-cultural study over the course of generations. And he says, even though masculinity looks different place to place, one ubiquitous, universal quality of males in all cultures, times, and places, with the possible exception of the recent history of the United States, had masculine initiation rites. And in those initiation rites, what you had is basically a boy who wanted the world around him to say, you're not just a good person, but you are a good man. Right? Boys crave that. Everybody says boys will be boys. Well, underneath every kind of risky, weird, foolish thing that boys often do is this kind of innate desire to be recognized as a man, right? I mean, why do you take your dad's car out and go 120 miles per hour in a highway so that your buddies know that you did it, right? Because you're a man, right? You know, and because it's kind of fun. But it's but that's always there. Now, if we don't recognize that desire in boys and give them some version of masculinity to which they can aspire, they're not going to stop wanting to be recognized as men. That's in them. I think it's hardwired into their psychology from millennia of evolution. They want to be recognized as men. If we don't give them a wholesome picture of masculinity to which they can aspire, then they will, like I said earlier, go and find it elsewhere. So then toxic masculinity, that is, if your version of toxic masculinity says that all versions of masculinity are undesirable, then you've basically told all of those boys there's nowhere for your desire to go.
Yes.
At least not here, at least not in our church, at least not in our school. Well, they'll go elsewhere. They'll go to the streets or they'll go to the internet to find places where they'll be recognized and where their masculinity will be savored.
Yes.
So that the church has no choice but to give boys some place to go where they can develop as men.
Yeah, and the sad part too is when they go to those places, especially right now on the internet, and it's always hard because I never know how much social media and the internet is actually a real reflection of what's going on in society. But so often what ends up happening is you have these overreactions to the emasculation, such as like Andrew Tate, and who I think is personally disgusting.
Yeah.
Or this constant scapegoating of the other. They talk about, the rise of women in society is the reason why you're like this, or, the capitalistic whatever is the reason that you're like this.
Yeah.
And instead of trying to focus in on, you need to work on you. You need to really work on your masculinity, your growth as a man, your mind, your body, your soul.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's their fault.
They're wrong.
They're wrong.
They're the cause of this.
And so we need to react
the
violently.
Exactly.
Exactly. And so we need to react violently to these things. And that's how you end up with these, kids, poor boys that are totally misunderstood about these things and want to just go to the MGTOW, what they call men going their own way, right? So they're not getting married anymore. They might date around or whatever, but they're not interested at all in a relationship or any kind of consecrated life or whatever it might be, some kind of mission in your life that you're going to give your life to. They just would rather say, no, I'm going to be myself, my selfish self, and go get mine,
right.
And
basically
so you end up
isolate.
Yes. And so you end up with these young boys that don't seek community. They just go out and get theirs.
Yeah.
And I think that what ends up happening is you have these boys almost brainwashed into this, and it becomes kind of a perpetual Peter Pan. You're just constantly a boy. You never reach that moment, which is why to get back to your point, the initiation rites are so darn important, because if they've never been told you are a good man and you belong to this society, you don't have the space that we're talking about to be vulnerable and open up about those moments where you feel weak. Open up about those moments of like, I don't know, people are telling me it's their fault. People are telling me it's their fault, but what's really going on? They don't have anyone around them to actually have those conversations.
Yeah. So then it becomes, the responsibility of fathers to create those spaces. Right. So when I think about your sacred responsibility as a father, my kids are very young now. But when they start, cresting into adolescence, to create spaces where my sons can talk about the things that they need to talk about, and make almost like the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, know that, son, this is going to stay here. You can utter the words that you need to utter in this context, and it's going to be all right. So one challenge, invitation that I would have for the folks listening to this podcast is, if you're a dad, are you creating that space for your sons? And one thing that I would add to that is, are you creating it with other men? Often, I just remember being a 15, 16-year-old boy myself, and I was a rebel. And a lot of men can relate to this, even though I had an exceptional dad, but there were certain things that I wouldn't hear from him. I would hear it from his friends. And my dad knew that too, Yeah. And sometimes I think the best thing that a dad can do to raise great sons is to cultivate not only his own masculinity, but cultivate around him a group of men into which he can usher his sons. And that might not look like, running around in loincloths in a campfire setting doing an initiation, right? But what a modern day initiation rite look like is just like, okay, so you've got a son who's 15. He kind of wants the world to start recognizing him as a man. You're at the Sunday afternoon barbecue. The man circle inevitably forms. You're around the grill. Sometimes, it's just as simple as, I'm going to step over here. Jimmy, you're going to stand right next to me, and I'm going to usher you into this community. You know, or in some instances, it might look a little bit more grandiose. I have a friend who, on his 16th birthday, his dad rented out a restaurant, tapped about 15 or 20 of his own friends on the shoulder, and on the son's 16th birthday, brought him in and had every one of his friends, basically his, the 16-year-old boy, his father's friends, all wrote him a letter saying, in my estimation, this is what it means to be a man, and I want you to have this. And by the way, I know that you are a good man.
That's awesome.
Men need to be ushered in, and not just into a relationship with an individual man, their father, but into a community of men. Do you have a community of men? Perhaps the best thing that you could do to form the masculinity of your son is to have friends, right, who are other good fathers, or at least good men, right, that you would want your son to be like, because they're not only going to be like you, right, they're going to be like your friends.
Yeah, and I think too that something that was really impactful for me with my fathers, we just did stuff together.
Yeah.
My dad and I would have deep conversations a lot of times, but a lot of times too, we were just like, we don't really need to talk. Let's just go do.
Yeah.
So we would like lift weights together. Or we would just go accomplish things together.
Yeah.
And it always felt like, we don't. It's kind of the unwritten rule of like, we don't really have to talk right now. It's all right.
Yeah. Like I'm okay with, like some people think it's a problem that men don't talk as much as women, especially in church context. And I'm just like, nope, totally fine.
Exactly. Reminds me of Ron Swanson talking about his best friend. He's like, we still don't talk.
There are, I don't want to say that too strong.
Sure.
In this context, but yeah, it's true. Sometimes you hear about the kind of the 3 Ps of masculinity. Have you heard this? Right. So good men are providers, protectors, and they procreate.
Okay.
Right? It's 3 Ps of masculinity, and that's a bit of a reduction, of course. But when I hear people say that, if you're a dad, I think there's a 4th P. It's that. So sure, you're a procreator, obviously, because you're a dad. And it is your responsibility to provide not only for your family's financial needs, but also for their emotional needs, to protect them, in all of the modern contexts, that and the ways that they would need protection. But perhaps more sacred than any of those other Ps is a 4th P, which is that as a father, you are to play. And perhaps the deepest investment that you could give to your kids especially when they're really, really young and impressionable, is not so much to give them an education that'll set them up for Stanford, right? But to waste time with them.
Yes.
And the psychological deep sink that happens when a dad goes into the backyard and just starts wrestling his boys.
Absolutely.
Right? Basically sets them up to be psychologically healthy,
Yes.
And so as you're doing, you talk about lifting weights. I don't think anywhere near as much as you, but I'm a little bit of a weightlifter myself. I like some of those stereotypically masculine things. But I want to kind of circle back to one part of our conversation at the beginning. I told you of the figure Joseph Pleck, the myth of masculinity, and his throwing masculinity out the window. Now, I think he threw the baby out with the bathwater, but there was some bathwater. And that ideal of masculinity that existed in 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, American culture, I worry, you talk about where is the masculine conversation today? I think that over the last 20 years, there has been real movement in giving men permission to be a man. But what I worry about right now in 2025 is that maybe we've swung that pendulum a little bit too far back. Like we long for, the straightforward culture of the 1950s. Okay. Well, there's a reason that the 1950s spawned the 1960s. And there was a reason that Joseph Pleck experienced a lot of anxiety in the face of John Wayne masculinity. And I think that we need to be very careful, in Catholic culture in particular. You think of, say, like a Catholic conference or something like that, to not return to that same constrictive cookie cutter version of masculinity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That there's, like, my boys will have a variety of different personalities. Some of them I hope will be great musicians. Some of them I hope are going to be killer businessmen. I only have 2 sons right now, but if I'm blessed with more boys, I hope that whatever their personality is, that I can help them sort of flourish in a masculine version of that personality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes people ask me, what's your favorite film or whatever, and that or piece of art that sort of shows masculinity? And I do like the movie Braveheart, Mel Gibson. But I think my favorite film, have you ever seen the movie Life is Beautiful?
Yes.
Italian film?
Yes.
Yeah. And what you have in that film, for those who haven't seen it, is a dad, Jewish dad, who is basically a goofball. Mm-hmm. He's a journalist, owns a little shop, bookstore. And part of the film is this dad, through his goofiness, playing with his child to distract the child and protect the child from the wiles of the Nazi regime. And in that goofiness, he just gives himself over completely and does a lot of self-sacrificial things. Just sort of stop it there so I don't ruin the film for folks. But he's like a frail-figured, goofy journalist, Jewish guy. Mm-hmm. He's a man, right? And as a church, we need to be willing to embrace these various different, what you might call versions of masculinity, and realize that's not like some concession. Like, we're not like throwing out the sexual binary when we do that. You know, like the church canonized, you know, both gentle figures like Therese of Lisieux and Joan of Arc, right? And they were both deeply feminine, okay? So too, in where we are right now, the tip of the spear in the conversations in masculinity, do we as a Catholic Church in the United States, we need to recognize different kinds of men.
Yes.
Right? And don't just say that, oh, masculinity is all and only machismo masculinity, because then I think we find ourselves right back to where the world was in the 1950s when Joseph Pleck wrote The Myths of Masculinity. So that's, I think, you know, in the early 2000s, I think the game was about just getting men to kind of come out. You know, it's okay to be a man. Well, I think we've crossed that threshold, but there's a danger of that pendulum swinging kind of back to some of the unsavory places that it was 60, 70 years ago.
Yeah, I think that is one of the symptoms that I see in the online Catholic space, to be completely honest, is that they create this box of what it means, which is, to me, a complete ignorance of the great men of the past. Yeah. Like, you've got Raphael, you've got, you know, Michelangelo, you've got these much more kind of soft-handed people that created these unbelievable pieces of art that we still love, or Mozart, or these other people that created these unbelievable things that now, based on their definition, wouldn't be in the box.
Right. And the box is very constrictive. You know, like, even speaking me personally, and I have like some of the, what you might call stereotypical masculine qualities. I like to lift weights. But there are some parts of me, like, I don't particularly enjoy watching sports. I'm just kind of not. I played every sport, many sports growing up. I just don't particularly enjoy it. Yeah. You know, watching them at least. Is there something unmasculine about that? I don't really think so. You know, I'm kind of over it. Like, I don't like the NFL, you know, like, moving on. Yeah, exactly. You know, I really like good books. Yes. You know, bring that on. And strangely enough, it's like, what are the qualities that are going to set our boys up to be great providers and protectors in, you know, in the future economy? Well, like, we haven't needed to lift heavy things for a long time. Right. You know, like, I would actually really like my sons to develop their interpersonal skills, because those interpersonal skills are going to be exactly the skills that get them ahead in the business world, for example, you know. So there's a danger there, I think, in the current Catholic online man space. Heard a commentator the other day say, like, all of the great saints of the past were like very physically fit men. That's just sort of patently false. You know, like, Thomas Aquinas, among the most influential saints that ever lived, was very fat. Yeah. You know, like, it's just like, and not, of course, health is a good thing. Sure. And you know, St. Thomas Aquinas shouldn't have been fat. Like, it would have been better if he was a healthy, you know, academic. Nevertheless, out of a desire to fend off kind of the evils of the pagan secular world, let's not go back to making the same mistakes that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers would have made when they were raising their sons and living in a masculine culture. Whenever the church goes through a period of time where some reality is sort of obliterated and wars are fought over, say, a doctrine or something like that, that's always a very scary time to live, right? You might think of the centuries where the doctrine of the incarnation, you know, caused literal wars. But in those same centuries, that's when the doctrine of the incarnation was articulated in all of its profundity and beauty. Right now, masculinity has been raised to the foundations. What we could do is sort of retreat back and try and like make a bunch of Catholic John Waynes of our sons. But that would be a mistake because they're not all going to be 6'4" and slinging a pistol. And even if they are, it's not going to be particularly helpful in the world today. What we can do is we can make masculinity anew.
Yeah.
In all of its splendor and its varied expression.
Yes.
Right. Of course, obviously, with respect for things like the sexual binary, like that's just sort of a given, right? But if you are Catholic, not to fall into the harmful reduction.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in Catholic circles, especially with JP2, you have this idea of a new feminism.
That's right.
One that still embraces all of the wonderful aspects of feminism, but is pro-life and is chaste and is, against the use of contraception and these kinds of things. It's almost as if we need a new masculinity that isn't defined by the machismo of the 80s or by the Mad Men era of the 50s and 60s or the 1920s, where there were some pretty rough times for women because of men. It's as if we need to be able to embrace those softer parts of us while still recognizing there are aspects of us that require strength, require courage, require bravery. In a new context. I like that you said even like the protection in a new context, because protection today may not be that I see a tribe coming up, we're going to have to gather the men together, It's more of like, that internet right there, I'm going to have to figure out what the heck, how to block that for my kids, and how to have them understand the real world, but protect some of their innocence as long as you can, to be able to go into the real world with an understanding of the things that want to hurt your innocence and hurt your dignity.
Right.
And so I just think that maybe there's something on the horizon of an idea of that. And I'm hoping that what we're seeing online is not what's happening in the real world. And I think that's actually true. I think what most men want is something like a new masculinity, something like, I don't want to be always rough on my kids. I want to love on my kids. I want to read my kids poetry. I want to, do the things that men aren't necessarily stereotypically told to do. But at the same time, I want to be the disciplinarian. I want them to know, there are rules in this house. You disrespect your mother, I'm the guy.
You're going to deal with me.
So I guess, we've talked a lot about, ideas around this, but any kind of final thoughts on, what you'd like maybe the men to hear, or also the women who are listening, what advice you might have or where we can go from here?
Yeah, I think for the men who are listening to this podcast, I'll circle back to a point that I made earlier, because I've just seen this particular thing work wonders in the lives of so many men. Do you have a small, close group of male friends? And if you don't, prioritize that among, over and above, so many other things. You can read books, you can, you should obviously pray. But I think that the most balanced, mature, integrated men that I've seen, they have that in their lives. So I'm in full-time ministry to men, and we place a really high premium on creating these spaces that we talked about earlier, spaces where men are safe enough to be vulnerable. And I think that if a guy adds as a regular part of his life a conversation with the same group of men over time, where you're not just shooting the breeze about sports or whatever kind of thing is going on out there in the world. I think a lot of men, they'll sit down, and especially if they're Catholics, they'll have conversations about theology and politics and stuff. And it's just like, sure, there's nothing wrong with theology and politics. Those are great things to talk about. I got a PhD in theology. I love theology. But if you're regularly talking about the things that are going on in your life, and particularly maybe those areas where you feel shame, the weaknesses of your current existence, if you do that, it's like the rest is details. It's if it wasn't scripture, I'd say it's cliche. Iron sharpens iron.
For sure.
Right? Do that in your life. Men throughout all of history have carved out exclusively male spaces. And simply by doing that fact, or by bringing that space rather into existence, they become better men. You know, just by being around other men, there's something that space in its exclusivity opens up for male development. We need to do that, but I think that the best male space is not so much the beer hall or the great big guild of 100 men, but more the like 4 to 8 guys, you know, who are real with one another. So I guess that's what I'd leave people with. If you're a woman listening to this, then encourage your husband to do that, and don't nag him when he does.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
And investing in that space is at the same time an investment in your marriage, right? And an investment in your fatherhood and your children.
Awesome. Well, John, this has been awesome, man.
Yeah.
Really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks again for everything you do.
Yeah.
And just keep up the great work, man.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
We hope you enjoyed the Benedictine Dialogues, a production of Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. To catch all the latest and support our growing platform, visit media.benedictine.edu. And be sure to recommend this show to your friends and family. Help us to transform culture in America, one conversation at a time.